Interviewed by TV in 2007, General Wesley Clark, former Supreme Commander of NATO during the Kosovo War, revealed that since 2001, the United States planned to destroy Iraq, Syria, Libya, and others. Former Yemeni President Salem, with Novosti Agency, declared that the Arab Spring was a U.S. plan, together with Israel, that nothing had to do with Arab peoples and their legitimate interests. The goal was to create chaos and destroy the Arab governments. If with changes of power everything goes worse, and look at Libya. Nevertheless, in 8 years of war in Syria, there are 500,000 people dead, most civilians, more than 13 million displaced, and almost the totality of the country destroyed, and millions in poverty situation. This is the outcome of the attempted invasion. 8 years after the war caused in Syria, this is our critical move again. We will look at actors and agencies. On March 15, there's 8 years of the beginning of war in Syria, which is not a civil riot, but war. The protest in Damascus, Aleppo, historic city, extended to other countries, and is included in the so-called Arab Spring. So much blood has brought for the nations of the region. For several years, we are listening that everything was created by the United States and Europe to overthrow the government of Bashar al-Assad and reconfigure the region's power. However, there are optimistic airs in the Arab Republic. We are sure to reach the final victory against this unfair war imposed over Syria, and we will reach it, even if the sponsors of terrorism wish all the contrary, because they refuse to recognize they were defeated. We are undergoing economic difficulties created by the war imposed to the country. Nevertheless, we are determined to reach victory with a united people together with its brave army. There's an international trend to solve the crisis. Nevertheless, some countries, in defense of their interests and ambitions in Syria, are trying to block any political solution and expand the war, keeping terrorist focus in the east of Syria. Let's look at the main concentration of terrorism at this time. It is the province of Relev in the west of the country. Those expelled by government troops together with Russian allies, for example, of different cities have grouped in this region and have destroyed and pillaged, as with many others. Idlib, a province located in the northwest of the Syrian Republic, capital is the same name, located at 600 meters above sea level, 700 kilometers from Aleppo, another a focus of terrorism until 2016, where the Arab Syrian government recovered this city. It is very important because it has the ancient city of Eblab, and in Ottoman times it was a very important commercial center. It used to produce almonds, sesame seeds, tomato. It does not have any access to sea. It is in the border with Turkey, and 2,000 people, 2 million people are inhabitants among the regrouped terrorists and retained inhabitants. There is no running water or electricity. There's no food. For medical assistance and food, it depends on foreign or outside aid. It was one of the few that came out of the war in 2011. In 2012, it was overtaken by terrorists, and later the government recovered. But in 2015, in the second battle, new terrorist occupation took place. Since June 2017, irregular groups are controlling it in full and are proposing the birth of an autonomous region. In September 2018, Russia attacks with bombs nearby places. In the Idlib government to the south is Janjay-Hum, also in dispute between terrorism and the legitimate government of Bashar al-Assad. In April 2017, it was a scenario of U.S. false flag operation. They invented a chemical attack to blame the government. Another hotspot is Al-Baghous Falkani in the government of Deir ez-Zor. Hispan TV, Iranian media, on March 10 published that al-Assad reports the economic war of the West against Syria. You have a picture and then details. The president has reported that one of the ways of pressing his country is the economic blockade. Last Sunday, he met with the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of China, and President al-Assad said that any differences that were solved with dialogue now are solved with economic war, terrorism, and blockade. Since the war broke out, Western countries with the United States at head have imposed sanctions that periodically are extended with their policies. Let's remember that the UN Security Council chose to sanction 7 Syrian ministers that are impeded to travel to the European Union, and in all it's 227 Syrian citizens, including the president and other ministries, besides 72 companies and entities. The next review will take place on June 1st, and it is expected to add others. In the meeting, China expressed its support and praised the government's struggle against terrorism. China said, "We will provide all possible aid." I will now go to Prensa Latina, Latin American press site, which on March 15 published that Syria has a politicization against it in Brussels. Syria denounced that by performing a meeting in Brussels without its participation, the UN has shown politicization. This behavior proves that the European Union is responsible of the unfair war against Syria and the suffering of Syrian people, especially due to unilateral sanctions. This deprives the European Union of all credibility at the time of talking about how to aid Syrians. It's ridiculous, irritating, and an expression of the hypocrisy characterized by Syrian enemies. The participants in this conference cry for Syrians while they are the first responsible for the blood shed in Syrian people. They unleashed a regular war, especially an economic war now. I will now go to Deutsche Welle, March 13, 2019. We found this article, Matthias von Hey, not precisely in favor of the government of Bashar al-Assad, but he says that money for Syria, he asks, and then he exclaims, first raise sanctions. The author considers that if the protection of the Syrian people and its interests would be taken serious, conditions should be created to promote the national reconstruction. To achieve this, money is not necessary to be transferred to Damascus. It is enough to raise massive sanctions imposed on the country since 2011. For example, in November 2018, before winter, the U.S. Ministry of Finance sanctioned oil and gas transportation to Syrian ports. The consequence is that fuel became scarce and more expensive as well, and this happened the same with food prices. Hence, 1/3 of the Syrian people are living in extreme poverty, according to United Nations data. uninterrupted years of war that have told the war through our platform Telesur. Our correspondent Hissam Wanouch, we will contact him to know a little more of what is happening there. Greetings, colleagues. Syria for 8 years has been living a terrorist war imposed by foreigners. It's not a civil war, as the Western media say. It's a ferocious aggression promoted by Israel, the United States, and its European and Arab allies that to date, according to UN nations, have killed around 1 million people and has forced almost half of the Syrian people to displace 6 million around the country and 5 million abroad, of which more than 1.5 million returned voluntarily to their places of origin after the Arab Syrian army liberated more than 80% of its territory, where 1,400 localities were freed and 518 joined the National Reconstruction Program, while terrorists remain active in the northwestern province of Al-Ter, together with U.S. invading forces that, in spite of the decision of the U.S. president to withdraw its troops from Syria, remain illegally on Syrian territory, that together with an international coalition under the false justification of struggling against Daesh, are murdering indefense civilians, destroying infrastructure, and pillaging the country's energy resources, increasing separatist factions in the Kurdish. Terrorists and its sponsors destroyed most infrastructure in the country, where more than 50 hospitals, more than 6,000 teachers, and 10,000 industrial facilities were damaged or destroyed. And this, together with the Western blockade, caused economic loss above $500 million. In spite of this harsh reality, Syria is advancing in its aim of national reconciliation and peace negotiations in Geneva. Likewise, negotiations are taking place in the trade arena with different countries for the reconstruction. A new constitution is being built as well. After winning the war against terror, Syria is confronting an economic and political war that obstaculizes the return of the refugees, peace in the country, and reconstruction. This is the information we have for now. Thank you, Hisham. As always, it's a pleasure to have you here in Critical Move. It's important to make a pause, and when we come back, we will contact our guest about the consequences and geopolitical implications of this 8-year war propitiated in Syria. Syria, 8 years of a war that has been promoted. Is the end coming? This is what we are asking in our Critical Move today. We want to add analysis as always, and we will connect with Argentina with Professor Ángel Molina, political analyst, member of the Study Center on National Diversity of the National University. Welcome. To this point, how do you see things? And I repeat our question, is the end near? I think we are in a particularly sensitive scenario. Perhaps we will see the end of something that was terribly started in 2011, but we will surely have especially long-lasting conditions after this aggression to Syrian sovereignty. Surely we will have a complex scenario with a very different Syria than that of 2011. This is undoubtedly the great success of the hostile forces against the Syrian government. It's a weakened Syria. Let's remember that by 2011, one of the historic aspirations of Syria was seeking military parity with Israel and dispute this hegemonic area in the region. Nevertheless, one of the most terrible consequences is the permanent destruction of Syrian sovereignty that forces it to seek international allies to confront hostility since 2011. Unfortunately, we also have terrible consequences in the construction of what happened in Syria. They still insist on this fiction and sequence of peaceful uprise that was magically translated in a civil war. They are still ignoring, at least in the official story, that crucial forces and external factors, especially Turkey and the Gulf monarchies at the time of explaining what we have as a long process since 2011 in this Syrian territory. I think this will be a very difficult task of disarticulating all this and return at a given time Syria to its historic enemy Israel for a different scenario in the region. When we started Critical Move, we were providing data. General Wesley Clark in 2007 was interviewed and revealed that the U.S. plan and the Israeli plan was to overthrow legitimate governments in the Arab world to geopolitically reconfigure this region where the United States has so many interests. I ask you, why is the Arab Syrian Republic so important geopolitically? I'm sorry, I don't have a good communication. Could you repeat the question, please? Sure, briefly. In geopolitical terms, why is Syria so important? Essentially, Syria, among Israel's members, has been the actor that somehow has sheltered Palestinian resistance and permanently supported the Lebanese resistance. It has been an actor among the Israeli neighbors, the only actor that has been permanently disputing military parity with Israel. It has been an especially conflictive state for Israeli interest in the region, and especially for the Arab monarchies. At the time of disputing legitimacy inside the Arab world, let's remember the ideological line that has, with Nasserism, has permanently reported the neo-colonial nature of Saudi Arabia and all Arab monarchies that, of course, has supported hostile actions against Syria, together with other actors that have been decisive, like the case of Turkey and, of course, Israel, but not only until 2007. Let's also think the declarations of Condoleezza Rice in 2005, who said exactly the same. Syria is a complex actor and that must be eliminated. It is an actor that disputes supremacy in the region against Israel, and this is what they did as of 2011. Have they achieved their goal with other governments of the region, even if they fragmented and stabilized them? In the case of Syria, why didn't they manage to do this? In the case of Syria, there are several important actors to understand why Syria has not been a complete victim, or at least they haven't managed to get one. There's a change in the attitude of global actors. This is essential for the future of Syria, which is Russia and China. After what happened in Libya, these actors changed their attitude in the region. Russia is firmly defending crucial geostrategic interests linked to its outlet by the Tartu support. China is also willing to dispute spaces related to its commercial projects, and there are also essential authors like the presence of Hezbollah to turn around, as of 2013 essentially, a war scenario that seemed favorable to Turkish and, of course, these so-called rebel forces with the support of the Arab monarchies. This allows to understand a series of repositions in an action line of what is known as the resistance axis that allows Syria's people and army to struggle and finally turn around a scenario that seemed hostile. Since 2013 to this date, things are changed essentially because of these key actors. And not all actors have acted the same in other scenarios. I think the space to compare could be Libya, where the position of Russia and China were completely the opposite. In this case, I think these two actors have been crucial to understand how the legitimate government of Syria has saved a situation. Do you think that finally the announcement made last year by U.S. President Donald Trump of withdrawing troops will take place? What Trump administration will do in the aspiration of his aspiration, the Middle East in the long term, is reduce military presence with their own troops. But we will surely see two parallel scenarios. On one hand, they will demand the actors that with U.S. interest, Gulf monarchies, Arab allies, to act in a more firm way against the dangers of actors like Syria. On the other hand, we will have undoubtedly a more active presence of actors that mean privatization of the conflict. A series of companies that work to replace state forces of other countries and outsource forces that continue defending these countries, but in a space of illegality or confused legality, which is very hard to confront. The privatization of the conflict in other areas, and of course the stronger influence of pro-U.S. Arab actors. Could France strengthen its presence in Syria with this reconfiguration if it happens? I think that what some international actors, especially European actors, are looking is that the Bashar al-Assad's administration has not fallen. Just some years ago, we have to review geography, they took this for granted. I think that these European governments will finally think how they can take profit of the reconstruction of Syria, which is a huge business. It always is after any war. And as they've done in other scenarios, for example, Lebanon, and the business of reconstruction of Iraq, nobody would like to remain outside in the economic reconstruction of Syria. I think that certain international actors, including France, will see how the conflict is resolved, how the government consolidates control over most of Syrian territory, and upon then how they negotiate commercial spaces to be part of the reconstruction processes and take the money out. I think there's a scenario to analyze on what these new imperial intervention ways mean in the reconstruction. A scenario to continue analyzing. Thank you very much for your participation, Professor.
Siempre es un gusto, que estén muy bien.
Igualmente. Despedimos al profesor Ángel Molina.
This was Professor Ángel Molina, and after a small pause, we will continue reviewing more of the geopolitical consequences and implications after this 8 years of war, and the role of actors in this strategic political place.
Sigamos analizando en esta
Let's continue
narrativa de la
analyzing this
ocupación de 8
critical
años de guerra
move
en
of
Siria.
8 years
Estamos
of war
ahora
in
con Marinela
Syria. We
Correggia.
have
Antes
Marinela
que el concepto
Correggio.
corresponsal de guerra prefiero utilizar el de
I would,
periodista de paz
instead
como
of
estamos
war
en el
correspondent, I would like to use a peace correspondent name. Thank you for Telesur, because Telesur are also peace correspondents and not war correspondents. I saw you in Libya. I was in Syria and Libya, and before in Iraq during the bombardments and the war with pacifist groups, or sometimes alone.
¿Qué experiencia se lleva o se llevó?
What experience did you have? It was a tragic experience that people, if there is someone who requests an intervention from an interference from abroad, they should know, and their ideas will change, because an air intervention means bombs, and this is terrible. There's also terrorist intervention with mercenaries. This means the destruction of a country, or at least millions of deaths, people who have lost their limbs. I saw this personally in Libya, Syria, and Iraq. It means just millions of people who were displaced from Syria, Iraq, and Yugoslavia also. We don't forget that it is the anniversary, 20 years of NATO war against Yugoslavia. That started on March 24. The war against Iraq was March 20th, and in Libya, March 19th. So intervention means destruction of a country. As we say, without a war, everything is possible. With war, nothing is possible. Everything is lost. That is the horror of war. I would like to ask about the role of the white helmets that have been so questioned, especially, of course, not by the traditional media. Are they accomplices of this aggression? Definitely they are, but we must say that the focus should not be only on white helmets. I have studied the vicious circle of actors who always increased the excuses that are always necessary for aggressions through terrorist groups. So this vicious circle is composed by many local and international actors. It's not only the media, it's not only the governments of what I call the axis of war, unfortunately including Italy, but these are also local actors like local NGOs or alleged NGOs. What role have they played? The role of these local NGOs related to international NGOs were truly entities of the armed opposition. It was impossible to distinguish them. So all this vicious circle, including the social networks and the international media, have fed an idea about the dictator that kills his own people. We have seen this in Libya with Milosevic, in Yugoslavia with Saddam in Iraq. And then everybody forgets, destructions remain in complete impunity, because the axis of war was never placed before an international court as it should be. And now, as we can see, there's the danger that they participate in the reconstruction. I still don't believe it, because Syria has declared many times that reconstruction will not be a business for those who destroyed the country. And to continue violating sovereignty, yes, and this is another natural consequence of an aggression war that is the supreme international crime. This is said by the United Nations. It's a violation of a basic principle of international law. At the beginning, we were reflecting on how those who block a country economically and are part of these international actors that propitiate war are talking about collecting funds to help aid the country, participate in the reconstruction. This is a painful paradox. This is another paradox or an oxymoron, because it happens in many cases. We have the case of Venezuela that is clear, but also Syria, because the same actors who I think that the war damages are around $200 billion. And then they say they're going to help somehow the NGOs or the European Union. And this is crazy. You give very, very little with one hand, and with the other hand, you destroy resources. And let's think, or you take away the resources. In Libya, they robbed all properties. And nobody can say that Libya is better after intervention. Yes, and we saw this during intervention also, what would happen. I was there since the first days, and you could see very clear that the so-called responsibility of protecting the Libyan people based on complete lies, which everybody believed, the truth was that NATO was the air force of the rebels, the terrorist rebels, and not struggling for liberty. But these were terrorist rebels, and this was destroyed. These terrorists carried out racist acts against black Africans and took away from the city all the inhabitants of Tahuerga, and they deported them as Nazis. And NATO was the air force that enabled these people to reach power, as they did in Kosovo. In Kosovo, these were drug traffickers that reached power thanks to NATO. In Syria, this didn't happen because there were other alliances, and they couldn't do it. Now, this format of war is tried to be extrapolated to our region, Latin America and Caribbean. I think that the sketch seems the same. I am sure that the outcome will be completely different because of many international reasons. International reasons include that the countries that are not a part of war, like NATO and its allies in the Near East, Petromonarchy, Israel, and Turkey, that also plays an ambiguous role. We must be aware of that. The other countries around the world that are not part of this very small and dangerous cannibal axis of war noticed what happened in Libya, so they won't allow now to play with this and use United Nations to this end. Many things changed with the war in Libya. Many realized, and we saw in the case of Syria, they almost destroyed Syria, but they didn't win. Thanks to Russia and other actors. And this is the international aspect. Venezuela has many international alliances, and I hope it will develop them at the maximum level. And as an alliance, I call our President Chavez started. And domestically, there are many differences as well, because I don't know Venezuela very much. It's the first time here, but I've read a lot and I watched Telesur. But the great difference I see between Venezuela and the countries that were destroyed, including Afghanistan, where I was, by the axis of war, is that Venezuela does not have the so-called Islamic extremist. It doesn't have tribes, and it doesn't have racial hatred. It's more a class hatred. But in the case of Libya, racial hatred was terrible. The powerful condemned Gaddafi because of some reasons, but local terrorists didn't like Gaddafi because Gaddafi helped Africa, and they were highly racist. They told me this. And this doesn't happen here. And they know that the Venezuelan people, even if it has an opposition that, in my opinion, is inexistent without international aid, and the upper middle class does not like guarimbas, there is an organized people. They go out to the streets all the time. So I think that would help. So domestic and international factors will result in a completely different success. Marinela, time is against us, but we were fortunate enough to listen to you and your experience. Thank you very much to Telesur. Let's go to our conclusions very quickly. A particularly sensitive scenario, a land of aggression against the sovereignty and self-determination of the Arab Syrian Republic. Nevertheless, 8 years, uninterrupted years after, they resist with the light at the end of the tunnel because, as we all know, the government of President Bashar al-Assad has recovered most of the bastions and had the terrorism. The incorporation of Russia, the willingness of China have been essential to reposition and reconfigure this support. We will see what happens in the next months, and we will tell you in Critical Move of Telesur. Thank you for being with us. Have a great weekend.